So, in the movie American Fiction, Jeffrey Wright plays an author named Thelonious Monk Ellison who finds himself disillusioned with publishing and his professorship. He clashes with students over racial issues, and his latest manuscript is rejected by publishers as it isn't quote-unquote black enough. Monk finds himself particularly frustrated with an author named Sintara Golden, who wrote a book titled Wees Lives in the Ghetto. He feels the book panders to white audiences through the use of black stereotypes. As his frustration comes to a head, he writes a book called My Pathology, a purposefully over-the-top satire that mocks what white readers expect from black literature. He submits it to multiple publishers under an assumed name in an effort to mock them. However, his plan backfires when publishers love it. One publisher offers him a $750,000 advance. Things just continue spiraling from there as Monk has to live two lives, eventually judging his own book for a prestigious literary competition. Critics praised the movie. Not only does it invite the viewer to consider race relations, but to do so inside and outside of fiction, hence the name, American Fiction.
It's like a pun or something!
And truly, it does seem like the kind of thing that could only happen in fiction. Right? Well, I'm sure you can see where this is going. Australia, 1944. A poetry journal called Angry Penguins featured the poetry from a previously unknown poet named Ern Malley. While the poetry was generally well received, doubts started flying as to the true identity of this so-called Ern Malley. In many ways, his story just sounded too good to be true. So, join me as we discuss Angry Penguins, one of the strangest court cases in Australia's history, the country's greatest literary hoax, and Ern Malley, the greatest poet who never was. But before we really get into it, let's talk a little bit more about hoaxes. Did you hear about the recent hoax phone calls that people send to a Utah tip line? Or as headlines explained, transgender activists flood Utah tip line with hoax reports to block bathroom law enforcement. Thanks to the sponsor of this video, Ground News, we can get straight to the facts of the story by comparing how different outlets chose to report on this story. Follow along at ground.news/roughestdrafts. Excerpts from the news outlets mention Utah's new bathroom law forcing individuals to use the bathroom that matches their sex assigned at birth. The tip line was set up to report anyone who wasn't using the quote-unquote correct bathroom. As Ground News' insights tell us, the tip line was flooded with over 10,000 reports. When looking at this story about the hoax calls to the Utah tip line, we see the majority of coverage came from left and center-leaning outlets. You can even compare headlines to see how the bias can affect framing. As left-leaning outlets reported, the Utah auditor slammed the transgender bathroom law and said that 10,000 hoax complaints flooded his office. As such, right-leaning sources reported that trans activists are crying wolf and flooding Utah bathroom tip line with false reports. Using the bias comparison tool, we see left-leaning outlets focus more on the motivations behind the hoax reports, while right-leaning outlets speculate on the potential for charges against those who made false reports. I honestly support Ground News' mission immensely, and I was super happy to have them reach out to me. As someone who likes to read and write, I recognize that bias is everywhere. Once again, you can use this QR code or the link in the description and pinned comment for 40% off of what everything Ground News has to offer. Thanks to Ground News for sponsoring this video. So, picture this. It's Australia, 1940. Just 1 year prior, Australia officially joined World War II. At the University of Adelaide, a 19-year-old student named Max Harris published the first issue of his literary journal, Angry Penguins. Max and his colleagues sought to forge a literary identity for Australia during the Modernist period. As per the University of Toledo, Modernism is a period in literary history which started around the early 1900s and continued until the early 1940s. Modernist writers in general rebelled against clear-cut storytelling and formulaic verse from the 19th century. Furthermore, Toledo credits Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman as the mother and father of modernism. Angry Penguins' first issue, which, fun fact, was funded thanks to Max Harris's mom, was a celebration of modernist literature. The journal's name was taken from one of Max's own modernist pieces, a poem titled Mithridatum of Despair. But even though Max and his cohorts loved modernist literature, well, not everyone was on board with the movement, even by the 1940s. Remember, World War II raged on with several Australians fighting in North Africa. The war created patriotic sentiments among Australians that clashed with the anarchistic undertones of modernist art. As such, Max's fellow students at the University of Adelaide joined in protest and ended up throwing Max in the River Torrens. As a quick aside, Max offered to jump into the river himself if his peers agreed to take up a collection for the war effort and the Red Cross, and while I think that speaks to Max's character, it's like, Max, buddy, you can't offer them something that sounds less fun than what they're already threatening to do. Like, why would they let you jump in when they could just throw you in? Think, Max. Anyway, getting back on track, Max's peers weren't the only ones against his mission and modernism. A pair of soldiers, Lieutenant James Macaulay and Corporal Harold Stewart, thought Max was a real fool. Macaulay and Stewart were themselves relatively unknown poets, but one thing was clear, they were not on board with modernist literature. The famous 20th century poet A.D. Hope also made his displeasure with modernism clear. In fact, one American journal referred to Hope as the 20th century's greatest 18th century poet. As such, Hope was no fan of angry penguins. Word has it that Hope even had a bit of a catchphrase, "Get Maxie." But despite the journal's opposition, Max was dedicated to his cause. Then, on October 28, 1943, something amazing happened. Max received a letter from a woman named Ethel Malley. I quote the letter. "Dear Sir, when I was going through my brother's things after his death, I found some poetry he had written. I am no judge of it myself, but a friend who I showed it to thinks it is very good and told me it should be published. On his advice, I am sending you some of the poems for an opinion. It would be a kindness if you could let me know whether you think there is anything in them. I am not a literary person myself, and I do not feel I understand what he wrote, but I feel that I ought to do something about them." Ern kept himself very much to himself, and lived on his own of late years, and he never said anything about writing poetry. He was very ill in the months before his death last July, and it may have affected his outlook. Max Harris was happy to oblige Ethel, and he was soon glad that he did. He discovered that Ern Malley's poetry was the stuff of genius. Through subsequent communications with Ethel, Max discovered that Ern died of Graves' disease at 25 years old. After leaving high school, Ern worked as a mechanic. At 17 years old, he went off to Melbourne where he supposedly worked as an insurance salesman, but Ethel admitted no one knew much about Ern's time away. In one of Ern's rare communications from Melbourne, he said he made money repairing watches and doing other odd jobs. And of course, unbeknownst to his family and the world, Ern wrote poetry. One can only imagine how Max felt receiving these poems from Ethel. Remember, his mission was to carve a national literary identity for Australia through angry penguins. And there, with Ern Malley's work, he thought he had some of the greatest poetry of the time, all from a local legend who was gone too soon. Perhaps Max thought he and his journal would go down in history as the vessel that brought Malley's work to the world. At some point after Ethel sent along Ern's entire bibliography, Max decided the next issue of Angry Penguins would be dedicated to Malley. The issue would feature 16 of his poems, along with an introduction and preface from Max. And while the issue also featured several other poets, it was clear that the 1944 autumn edition of Angry Penguins would be Ern's edition. Just as the cover stated, the autumn number would commemorate the Australian poet Ern Malley. In his introduction, Max wrote, "Ern Malley prepared for his death quietly confident that he was a great poet, and that he would be known as such. He prepared his manuscript to that end. There was no ostentation nor the exhibitionism of the dying in the act. It was an act of calm, controlled confidence. He treated death greatly and as poetry, while undergoing the most fearful and debilitating nervous strain that a human being could possibly endure." Taking this issue page by page, this is the first Malley poem the reader would come across. Dearer Innsbruck, 1495. I had often, cowled in the slumberous heavy air, closed my inanimate lids to find it real, as I knew it would be, the colorful spires and pointed roofs, the high snows glimpsed at the back, all reversed in the quiet reflecting waters, not knowing then that Dürer perceived it too. Now I find that once more I have shrunk to an interloper, robber of dead men's dream. I had read in books that art is not easy, but no one warned that the mind repeats, in its ignorance, the vision of others. I am still the black swan of trespass on alien waters. Just like Max, readers quickly fell in love with the poetry of Ern Malley. When Max showed his pride and joy to one of his old lecturers, Brian Elliott, the writer also expressed his praise for the poetry. However, there was one small problem. Elliott immediately suspected that Max himself had written the poetry and came up with Malley as an alias. He claimed that Ern Malley and his poems were self-satire on Max's part. In the university's paper, Elliott made his claims against Malley. Alongside other academics, he acknowledged the quality of the poems, but also made it clear that he suspected there was no Ern Malley. The article's title read, "Local Lecturer Cries Hoax. Is Malley Malley, or Malley Harris, or who?" Thus, 7 months after the poems were published, the Ern Malley scandal erupted. The suspicion seemed warranted at the time. Ern Malley's story was a little too convenient, especially for Max. A man looking to carve out Australia's literary identity had some of the greatest modernist Australian literature falling into his lap. And not only that, but the poet was unreachable for comment because he was allegedly dead. It all sounded too good to be true. Soon enough, a reporter was knocking on Max's door at 2 a.m. to quiz him about the poems. Max would soon hire a private investigator named Bannister to uncover the truth of the whole matter. But did he only do so to throw suspicion off of him? Because soon enough, this private detective hurled suspicions at another writer, J.I.M. Stewart, also known as Michael Innes. A crime fiction writer, Innes was among the first to see Ern Malley's poetry. Max showed Innes the first batch of Malley poems sometime before they were published. Innes wasn't impressed with the literature despite Max's enthusiasm. When the private detective reached Innes, the writer acknowledged that he'd heard of Max Harris and Ern Malley. But while Innes confessed to nothing, it was becoming abundantly clear that Ern Malley didn't exist. Bannister would stake out Malley's address, 14 Dalmar Street. Staking out the address offered no leads, but Bannister could confirm that there was no E. Malley in the area thanks to the local electoral roll. As all of this went down, Max received a postcard. He didn't think much of it. He pinned it to the wall and carried on with the stress of the hoax. Meanwhile, A.D. Hope was preparing a scathing review of Max Harris's surrealist novel, The Vegetative Eye. Perhaps Hope invented Ern Malley to draw more criticism to Max, thereby bolstering his own review. But whether Hope was Malley's true identity or not, he certainly took joy in seeing Max's suffering. So, who was Ern Malley? Was it Max trying to bolster his own career and journal? Was it Innes looking to pull a fast one on Max? Was it Hope seeking to humiliate Max, to get him as he always sought out to do? Or was it actually 2 other authors that Max suspected, Michael Keon and Adrian Lawler? Well, as it turned out, a group of journalists already knew the identity of Ern Malley, or rather, the identities. The man posing as Ern Malley told his secret to an up-and-coming journalist. Once she brought the truth to the papers, it was all over. The journalists scoured to get comments from those involved. Meanwhile, private investigator Bannister was getting close to the truth as well, along with the University of Adelaide's paper. The university decided to look into Ethel Malley's address, 14 Dalmar Street. Except, there was just one problem. The address was never 14 Dalmar Street. It was 40 Dalmar Street. Bannister got the address wrong when he initially went to stake it out. One of the students working on the university's paper allegedly recognized the address. It belonged to a former student. Bannister went to investigate 40 Dalmar Street. He discovered the home occupied by the Stewart family. When the detective asked the family about Ern Malley, they told him the man he was looking for was in the hospital. Corporal Harold Stewart was in the hospital recovering from surgery on an abscess. He couldn't keep his secret much longer as the reporter to whom he told his secret had him dead to rights. But Stewart wasn't the only one to create Ern Malley. He was joined by his friend, Lieutenant James Macaulay. Stewart and Macaulay were 2 students of poetry trying to make a name for themselves. Following in the footsteps of A.D. Hope, they slammed Max and all modernist literature. The 2 were enlisted in a military intelligence unit. Macaulay was rather staunchly conservative. He hated communism and advocated for, quote, the sanctity of Christian marriage. He and Stewart both shared a hatred of modernism. In an effort to make a fool of Max, his journal, and modernism, they wrote up Ern Malley's full bibliography in one afternoon, using only a few books that they had on hand. In writing the poems, the pair wrote down 3 rules for themselves. To paraphrase, 1. There would be no coherent theme, at most only confused and inconsistent hints at meaning held out as bait to the reader. 2. There would be no care taken with verse or technique, except occasionally to accentuate its general sloppiness by deliberate crudities. 3. The poems would imitate the literary fashion that Max obsessed over, from the works of Dylan Thomas, Henry Treece, and others. Stewart typed up the poems, making deliberate errors and corrections to up the authenticity. To age the poems, each paper received exposure to sun and dust. They then invented Ethel Malley along with all of Ern's backstory, which allegedly took more time and thought than the poems themselves. Before the truth about Stewart and Macaulay came to light, Max had to consider that he might have been flat-out duped. In a letter to one of his colleagues, he admitted that he may have jumped the gun with Malley's poetry, having been a little too eager to publish them. Nevertheless, he believed in the quality of the work and vowed to take full responsibility, no matter what happened. Unfortunately for Max, the Malley hoax spiraled from a mere literary issue to a political issue. You'll recall, the Australian establishment had always maligned Max's works and journal for its leftist sentiments. Now, even the Catholic Church jumped in to condemn Harris and his journal. Amid Max's downward spiral, the police soon showed up at his door. One Detective Vogelsong showed up to Max's office, questioning him in regards to immoral or indecent publications. Suddenly, Max wasn't just defending Ern Malley's poems on the grounds of literary merit, he was defending them on the grounds of their legality. People reportedly mocked and jeered at Max as he made his way into the courtroom, allegedly going as far as to spit on him. The courtroom was packed. The trial wasn't truly meant to charge Max or his journal with obscenity. The trial was meant to discredit and make a fool of Max. And with that being the end goal, things didn't exactly stay on the rails. On the prosecuting side, Detective Vogelsong denounced a poem called Night Piece, noting that the personage in the poem was shining a torch in the dark, visiting through the park gates. To my mind, they were going there for some disapproved motive. I have found that people who go into parks at night go there for immoral purposes. He also criticized the use of the word incestuous in a poem called Egyptian Register. However, the detective also admitted that he did not understand the word's meaning in the context of the poem. One of the papers at the time reported that D.C. Williams, who represented the Crown Law Department, said, "The poetry is full of long words which has no meaning." One of Max's representatives pointed out that such a condemnation had nothing to do with obscenity. When prosecutors questioned Max about the poems directly, he gave such responses as, "You had better ask the author," with everyone knowing full well that the author didn't exist. He further explained that he'd need a good deal of time to analyze any of the given poems, but argued that they were no more indecent than Chaucer or Shakespeare. He even challenged prosecutors to take some time with the poems themselves. Prosecutors further asked Max if he'd considered the high school students who might read Malley's poetry and the effect it might have on them. Max responded that he could think of a good deal of the Bible that would have a worse effect. And as to whether some people wouldn't apply an indecent interpretation to a poem called Bolt to Marina, Max said that some people would place an indecent interpretation on anything. Reportedly, the trial was filled with several bursts of laughter while one of Max's representatives cross-examined the detective. Perhaps you see the irony in the trial. Macaulay and Stewart wrote the poems as parodies of modernist literature, suggesting there was no meaning behind any of them. Now, in a court of law, their poems were being placed under a microscope as both prosecution and defense looked for the meaning therein. In the end, Max managed to avoid 6 weeks in jail, but he did face some consequences. The magistrate told Max that he had far too great a fondness for sexual references. He had to cough up £5 as a fine for his purported crime. Max's reputation took a huge hit after the Ern Malley hoax, or the Ern Malley affair as it's often called, and arguably it never really recovered, at least in the sense that we don't know what Max's present-day reputation would have looked like without the humiliation he suffered at the hands of his contemporaries. And after the embarrassment of the whole affair, Max wrote less and less. However, that's not to say that Max amounted to nothing. Even with Angry Penguins, Max platformed some pretty significant writers like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, bolstering their careers across Australia and the world. He also developed a chain of bookstores and took on major publishing houses to provide affordable books to Australian readers. He went on to publish other journals apart from Angry Penguins, and became a columnist for The Australian. During that time, readers came to know him as Australia's cultural catalyst. And even though he doesn't exactly have worldwide acclaim, his poems frequently ended up in major anthologies of Australian poetry. The National Library of Australia published a compilation of Max's poems after his death titled The Angry Penguin, Selected Poems of Max Harris. The National Library named him one of the greatest lyric poets the country had ever produced. As for the hoaxers, well, ironically, the most notable thing about them was Ern Malley, a poet whom they never intended to be taken seriously. Stewart and Max never buried the hatchet. He reportedly maintained his animosity toward the Angry Penguins editor for the rest of their lives. Macaulay, on the other hand, felt almost immediate remorse for what they had done. Remember that postcard Max received amid the height of the hoax? As it turns out, that postcard was from Macaulay, leaving a clue for Max. Unfortunately, it completely went over Max's head. He would later reconcile with Max, and the two communicated every now and again. Ern Malley became more widely read than Macaulay or Stewart would ever be. Indeed, Malley's poetry lives on. It's still read and analyzed in classrooms to this day. I've always said that poetry is a very intentional art form. Every detail counts. However, perhaps Ern Malley proves to us that, on occasion, language can be just as engaging when it's random and neurotic. That being said, some folks dispute the claim that Stewart and Macaulay wrote the Malley poems in just one afternoon. Max Harris found the hoaxers' claims dubious, suspecting the pieces took more work than the scammers asserted. And just as Max promised he would do, he took responsibility and defended Ern Malley's poetry until his death in 1995. Max asserted that the persona of Ern Malley liberated Macaulay and Stewart, allowing them to write the best work they'd ever created. And despite everything that went down, years on, Max wrote, "I still believe in Ern Malley." The poetry and story of Ern Malley are so engaging that it's hard to believe it all really happened. It almost makes you wonder if something like this could happen today. But that's a question for another day. We started this little tale by discussing American fiction. Even though Malley himself was fictional, perhaps there was something more real to him than anyone could have imagined, certainly more than his creators could have imagined. The Ern Malley affair inspired multiple stories, poems, and visual art pieces, like these portraits by Sidney Nolan, which depict the poet in all his reality and all his fiction. An author named Stephen Orr wrote a book called Sincerely Ethel Malley, which imagines the fictional Ethel as a real, living, breathing personage. In commenting on the book, Orr said, "That's what writers do. We want something there, and it's not there, so we make it ourselves." I think it's only fitting today that we end with a poem from Max Harris. If it weren't for Max, we never would have had Malley. This piece is called Mythodratum of Despair. We know no mythodratum of despair, as drunks, the angry penguins of the night, straddling the cobbles of the square, tying a shoelace by fogged lamplight. We know no astringent pain, no flecking of thought's dull eternal sea, in garret image of Spain, and love, now love's parody. See chaos spark struck from flint, and the plunging distemper flare in the dawn's dull seep, of milk cart horse, morning horse, chaos horse, walking at 3 to the doors of sleep. With the creamy poison, convulsions endure, from 9 to 5, all life immure, and still alive. We know no mythodratum, nor the remembered dregs of fear. The glass stands dry and silted, no end is near. As I close out this video, I want to make everyone aware of just a couple things. Firstly, the National Library of Australia has the entire Ern Malley issue of Angry Penguins scanned online. If you want to read Malley's poems for yourself as they were originally published, all 16 are available for free. I also want to acknowledge earnmalley.net, which Australian journalists Samala Harris and Samuel de Northwood Harris put together. The website was so helpful in bringing this video to life, and it has even more information than what I presented here. Please check it out if you want to learn more about this whole story. But hey, what did you think of the Ern Malley affair? What do you think of his poetry? What do you think of Max's? Does the hoax inspire you in any way? Please tell me everything, and hey, before you go, take a look at this work from one of my patrons. These are song lyrics by Chris Pitts. The song is called Wound That Won't Heal. Buried away, deep in their weeds, this wound that won't heal just constantly bleeds. So inside my garden, where there is no mud, the violets and roses are growing in blood. As years have gone by, I've learned how to laugh and smile a little, but how long will I last? Because buried away, deep in the weeds, is a wound that won't heal, it just constantly bleeds. It gnaws at my insides and glows in the dark. The wound that won't heal has calloused my heart. And how I have longed for a touch of your robe to dry up the blood for us all to be whole. So I will not rest, I will scream in the weeds, for my wound that won't heal, that just constantly bleeds. For the chance to have one of your pieces featured at the end of my videos, or if you just like what I do and want to support the channel, consider joining my Patreon. You'll also get early access to videos, access to the community Discord, and priority for reviews on the second channel. Go subscribe over there if you want for some writing tips and opinions. I genuinely can't thank my patrons enough. If you want to support the channel in other important ways, liking, commenting, and subscribing goes a long way. You're also welcome to follow me on Instagram to see what I'm reading, and Twitter to see me post first drafts of poems. Thanks for watching, and ultimately keep in mind, this is a rough draft.